across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
It's 6 o'clock. I'm John Pienaar. Welcome to Pienaar Friends. Tonight, that is Rachel Cunliffe, the associate editor of the New Statesman, and we're going to be joined by the political commentator Tim Montgomerie, and I'm happy to say by you. So share your thoughts. Do send me a text, send me a tweet, and we are about to go live on YouTube. You can see us as well as listen and join in any way you like. Find us on the Times Radio YouTube channel, all after the news with Andy Hayes.
Thank you, John. Good evening. Ukraine and Russia have agreed a ceasefire in the Black Sea. The White House says it's got separate commitments from both countries to stop military strikes on energy targets. The US also says it'll help to restore Moscow's agriculture exports, though it's unclear what that means for Western sanctions. Defence analyst Michael Clark doesn't think the Kremlin has made any real concessions, though.
This would be something that the US can boast about, and fair enough, good for them. But they won't address the central issue. Unless the Americans are prepared to pressure Russia, as opposed to just keep offering them more advantages, more carrots and no sticks, the war will just go on.
Top US officials have been described as reckless and sloppy after a journalist was added to a high-level group chat. Donald Trump is playing down the security breach, saying the leaking of plans about military strikes on Yemen was merely a glitch. During a hearing of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Democratic Senator Mark Warner has been questioning National Intelligence Director Tulsi Gabbard.
There was no classified material that was shared.
So then if there was no classified material, share it with the committee. These are important jobs. This is our national security. If this was a rank and file intelligence officer, what would you do with them?
There was no classified material that was shared.
And if there's no classified materials, share.
The former footballer Joey Barton's been convicted of assaulting his wife after he grabbed her, pushed her over and kicked her in the head. It happened at their home in southwest London in June 2021. He's been given a 12-week suspended sentence. Georgia Barton had a lump on her forehead and a bleeding nose. Experts are warning about a new and unprecedented threat from online gangs which use chat groups to manipulate children into self-harming or committing sexual abuse. The National Crime Agency says it's increasingly convicting offenders linked to so-called comm rings. One of its bosses, James Babbage, says there was a six-fold increase in reports in the UK between 2022 and 2024.
There are parts of a city that you wouldn't let your children wander through at night. There are a mixture of obligations on the police force, the local council and you as a parent. So on the online world, we need to be understanding what our responsibilities and obligations are and all playing our part together.
The body of a newborn baby's been found in a bag outside a church in Notting Hill in West London. Scotland Yard's asking the mother to come forward for her own welfare. The sex and age of the child have not been made public. The King and Queen's state visits to the Vatican has been postponed as the Pope recovers from pneumonia. Francis arrived back on Sunday after spending 5 weeks in hospital. Buckingham Palace says it's by mutual agreement. And counter-terror police say a fire at a substation in West London which forced Heathrow to close on Friday is no longer a potentially criminal matter. Officers say there's no evidence to suggest suspicious activity. Flames caused a power cut at the airport, leading to the cancellation of almost 1,500 flights. And don't forget you can set the Times News briefing as your flash briefing on Alexa.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app, and via your smart speaker.
John Pienaar on Times Radio Drive with NatWest Cushion.
It's really good to have you with us here on Pienaar and Friends, an hour of good conversation in very good company. Just a couple of tips. No matter how you listen, you're always very welcome, but there are lots of different ways. If you've got an Amazon, Google or Apple device, just ask it to play Times Radio and there we will be. If you've got a DAB digital radio at home or in the car and you haven't used it to get Times Radio, give that a shot. Retune and you can pick us up. And once you've done that, you can just spend the next hour in our company and with all of us in each other's company. Always a pleasure. And we are on YouTube this evening as usual now, so you can see us as well as hear us. You can see Tim Montgomerie, the political commentator of the ConservativeHome founder, who's here. Hello to you, Tim.
Hi, John.
Hi, and Rachel Cunliffe, the associate editor at The Statesman. Hello to you, Rachel.
Hello.
Can I start with you and your thought for the day?
Yes, so my thought for the day is this new paper that's come out from the think tank Reform, not to be confused with the party Reform, completely separate, a non-partisan think tank, and it's called Everythingism, and they list a whole load of government a whole load of decisions that have been made on various things, such as the Planning Inspectorate recommending against a new nuclear power station, in part because of concerns that the new workers would dilute the proportion of Welsh speakers in the area. There's the HS2 Bat Tunnel, which we all know about. There's hospitals and schools being told to buy British fruit and vegetables to support the farming industry. There's the Department of Education trying to get the curriculum to represent the diversity of British society. All of these examples where there's like one policy aim, which is build new houses or build infrastructure or get our hospitals working better. And then an organisation has come in and gone, oh, it'd be really great if it could also help with this other aim, whether that's biodiversity or the environment or diversity in British society, etc., etc. And the argument is that we're so focused on everything, doing everything, as it were, that we're not doing anything well. And we have to, one, get better at understanding that policies come with trade-offs. And if you're going to build a new power station or some new homes, then maybe there will be an impact on biodiversity and you mitigate that in other ways. But two, sometimes something can just be good at the thing that it's intended to be good at. And this sort of cross-departmental agenda where everything has to benefit every other aspect of what the government is doing is actually really harmful and holding us back. And I thought that was interesting. So everythingism is the name of the paper.
Everythingism. Tim, what's your thought for the day?
I've just been having a little look at opinion polls recently, and we've had a lot of volatility in opinion polls. And I think I became interested in having a sort of, a closer look at opinion polls after the whole sort of scandal, in inverted commas, that engulfed my party, Reform Party, a couple of weeks ago with Rupert Lowe. And I was sort of very struck after all the attention that got, how actually Reform's opinion poll rating basically didn't change at all, despite, sort of Westminster Village thinking this was going to be a big impact on Reform. It didn't change. And personally, I think that's because people are voting Reform for reasons that don't really have anything much to do with the internal politics of Reform. They've given up on the mainstream political parties. And that's not going to change. It's going to take something very substantial to alter that. But actually, it's not just Reform's opinion poll rating that's been stable now for 2 or 3 months. We had a lot of change after the general election. But you look at the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, all basically much of a muchness now, and they have been for a little while. All about, 25%, a little bit sometimes above, sometimes a little bit below. But I wonder whether, just for the moment, we've settled into a new normal in where the British political parties are. And what is going to change that is what I think we all need to be on the lookout for.
Yes.
But actually, after a period of a lot of volatility, we seem to settle into a position which, if this carries on, we'll have one of the most interesting general election results.
Yes.
Not saying that it will carry on, there's a long time to go. But actually, I think we've reached basically the core Labour vote, the core Tory vote, and potentially the core Reform vote, with the Liberal Democrats sort of 7, 8, 9 points behind in sort of the mid-teens. And it's interesting, really, that if this continues, we're really into quite a deadlock, quite a paralysis, really, in our opinion, with no one political party able to break through into anything close to majority territory.
Yeah, well, certainly a kind of a stasis.
Yeah.
I mean, it is also true against all of that everybody now understands that we're not in the business of choosing a government.
No,
we're not.
absolutely.
We're not in the business of choosing a new government.
Yeah.
That time will come, seemingly in a few years' time, but it ain't now. And you seem to be, I think, recognising there that a lot of the support for Reform is as the none of the above party, and I'm very hacked off about everything party, and that can persist for a very long time. But is that enough, though, to persist until the time comes to choose a government? Because then you're asking yourselves very different questions.
No, absolutely are. And for what my party has to do, the Reform Party, it has to get its policies on immigration, on the environment, on net zero, on tax right. And it hasn't got there yet. But like all the parties, it has time.
Okay. Now I want to talk now, guys, about the big story of the day. I think I've said before, I sometimes imagine, and it's a false idea, that I'm beyond being shocked. I think I've seen everything, and then the very next day, I find that I am surprised and shocked and amazed, and maybe that's not a bad thing. When we stop being amazed, then we are in trouble. But let's talk about that. What's the Signal chat group, the line where the most high-ranking members of the Donald Trump administration talk to each other on a commercial platform about a coming attack on Yemen, on the Houthis of Yemen, and to stop their attacks on passing ships on their way to and from the Suez Canal. It's one of our world's principal sea routes, and it was decided that America was going to do something about that. And then we learned that there were doubts about it in the mind of the Vice President, J.D. Vance. And his hesitation was because he didn't want to do Europe a favour, which raises all sorts of questions. I mean, the abusive language that we saw in that conversation online, some of it was, if we're being clear, wasn't entirely surprising. The idea that they are upset in the Trump administration, not just the Trump administration, about European allies not putting their weight for defence. That is an old complaint, and it predates this administration. It goes back many, many years. But the way it was expressed and the depth of that hostility, even hatred, was in its way really quite remarkable. I want to catch up first, before we get round to that, with the talks that have been going on in Saudi Arabia today on a ceasefire in Ukraine. It does seem Russia and Ukraine, they discussed a ceasefire in the Black Sea. Maybe less to it than meets the eye, but I asked John Herbst, the former US ambassador to Ukraine, to give me his analysis.
Look, there's not real agreement. And in fact, a ceasefire on the Black Sea actually helps the Russians more than the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
The surprising thing, the amazing thing, is that if you look at the White House statement, they're willing to provide some concessions to Russia for an agreement which is essentially in Russia's benefit.
Yes.
And there's no comparable concessions to Ukraine from the United States. But equally amazing is that the Russians want far more than the concessions that the White House statement suggests. They want removal of major sanctions, as opposed to American help with insurance, with getting Russian access to agricultural markets again. So the Russians, seeing the White House being willing to make concessions to Moscow, are demanding even more concessions.
Yeah.
That's not a good look for the United States. It's not going to help achieve a stable peace.
So what is it that came out of those talks in Riyadh? Well, Russia was looking to get out more than they put in, which is maybe the least surprising thing you could imagine from talks like these. I spoke also to Eric Green, who was Russia director of the US Security Council from 2021 to 2023, and he talked about the disparity between American and Russian accounts of what had been agreed.
They're both talking about the same kind of themes, about this Black Sea initiative to have a ceasefire in the Black Sea, which actually there's been a de facto ceasefire in the Black Sea since November 2023, and also building on the idea of a ceasefire on energy infrastructure. But then when you look at the content of each statement, the Kremlin statement is very much talking about the need for sanctions relief up front before they're interested in actually implementing the Black Sea ceasefire, whereas the U.S. statement is much more general and saying they want to facilitate Russia's return to some of the agricultural markets.
Yes. So what have we got here? An agreement on this, an agreement on that. Maybe put them all together, and there's rather less than meets the eye to all of it. I want to first welcome to the programme a familiar visitor, guest and friend, Molly Ball from the Wall Street Journal. Hello to you, Molly.
Hello, John. Great to be here.
Lovely to have you here, Molly. And I do want to come on, as you'd imagine, to talk about the row, the fiasco surrounding the online Signal conversation concerning high-level secrets on the attack on the Houthis of Yemen. Of course, I want to come to that. But first of all, Molly, your thoughts on what was discussed in Riyadh today. Is it fair to say that it added up to maybe a lot less than met the eye?
I think that's fair to say. I don't know much more about it than you just laid out here, but it does seem like the dynamic that is evolving in this process is the Americans trying to broker these talks, trying to push Russia along in these negotiations, and the sense is that Russia is maybe prolonging this for as long as they possibly can, and meanwhile the fighting hasn't stopped. So I think there's a real question about what, if any, effect this is all having on the ongoing conflict there.
Okay, Molly, do stick with us. I'm going to talk about the main event, the row that's rather engulfing politics in America and just absorbing the rest of us around the world. Get your thoughts on that, and the thoughts of Tim, and the thoughts of Rachel. This is Pienaar Friends in association with NatWest Cushion, making workplace pensions and savings easy. Search NatWest Cushion to find out more.
Nobody
the Times Radio app, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
John Pienaar on Times Radio Drive with NatWest Cushion, putting your employees in control of their financial future. Search NatWest Cushion to find out more.
Now, Tim Montgomerie is here with me, so is Rachel Cunliffe, and so is Molly Ball from the Wall Street Journal. So, guys, this has just come out. It's a message from the founder of the online commercial messaging app, Signal. And what he says is, there are so many great opportunities to be on Signal now, including the opportunity for the Vice President of the United States of America to randomly add you to a group chat for coordination of sensitive military operations. Don't sleep on this opportunity. Molly. I mean, one of the things I love about you, Molly, is that you seem to be unshockable. I tell you again, I've been shocked. Are you going to tell me again that this is not shocking?
No, it is shocking that this has happened, but I will revert once again to the phrase that I use for many things having to do with this administration, which is shocking but not surprising. I think this is, not, although it is shocking in all kinds of ways that so many top members of the administration were having these conversations in such a casual and seemingly unsecure manner, and of course that they looped in a top journalist in these discussions. We see the sort of slipshod way a lot of business is conducted in this administration, yes. And it isn't that surprising that it has come out in this way. Yeah,
in the days that we used to call normal, and that memory is really pretty much faded from my mind now. But back in the days of when we used to call things normal, there would be sackings after this sort of thing. There could be prosecutions of the way that high-level secret intelligence concerning a military attack was allowed to be leaked out to a journalist, was shared on a commercial app, Molly. And we know, don't we, for sure, that nothing of the kind is going to happen here. And that is, again, if not a shock, if not even a surprise, it is cause for concern, isn't it?
I don't think we know that yet for sure. I mean, the administration, the president himself expressed confidence in the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, who was the one who added the journalist to the group chat. There are also questions about the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who was the one who shared the logistical and other information concerning this airstrike on the group chat. I think there are ongoing questions, and a lot of these, a few of these important officials happened to be in front of a Senate committee for a previously scheduled intelligence hearing today, and they were questioned very aggressively, particularly by the Democrats on the committee. But so the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, as well as the CIA Director, John Ratcliffe, getting a lot of questions about how this occurred and what was shared. And after initially saying that they did not believe any classified information was shared in this group chat, they sort of backed off that and said, well, they didn't see any information that was under classification by their agencies. Right. But there are still questions about this information that was shared by the Secretary of Defense. So I think the administration, although they are claiming that this is not a big deal and sort of trying to move past it, I don't think this is over as a story. There are going to be congressional investigations. The White House has said they are doing a review, and so there could still be some potential consequences for members of the administration. Right. I mean, look, the Attorney General answers to the President, so does the Justice Department, so do the investigatory agencies, and we know that all of those agencies and individuals will do as the President bids, and he's calling it a non-issue. So against that, you would still suggest there is a possible peril for one or more of those involved? I just think this is an evolving situation, and I think we can't rule anything out. The president tends to be sensitive to coverage of him and his administration. He tends to be sensitive to anything that he feels is making him look bad. So if this is going to continue to be a story for days at a time, and if the president starts to feel that, people in his administration are conducting themselves in a manner that reflects poorly on him, then I think we could expect to see him potentially impose some consequences. So the fact that his initial reaction was to say that it was okay and it was just a mistake and he was going to move on. I'm not predicting anything here. I'm just saying I think the door is still open to there being potential further fallout from this story.
Okay, Tim Montgomerie and Rachel Cunliffe are here with me. Rachel.
So over here, it's very small compared to everything that's going on. Everything happening in the UK seems small compared to what's going on in the US. But we had our own WhatsApp scandal involving officials, government ministers and the like using WhatsApp, conducting government business via WhatsApp. And we had lots of questions. I don't think we resolved anything, but lots of questions being asked about if you are conducting official government business that way, what does that mean for freedom of information? What does that mean for accountability? Yeah. If ministers and officials are using disappearing messages, then there's no paper trail involved. And obviously that's before you even get to the security implications of using commercial platforms for this kind of government work. So far, the conversation on Signalgate, which I know, John, you hate calling it that, but the conversation about this has been shock and horror that a journalist was accidentally added to the group, which is incredibly shocking and horrifying. But I just wonder, Molly, how much concern has there been, regardless of the journalist being added, that this very, very sensitive national security conversation is happening on a commercial platform where presumably there doesn't have to be any kept record of it, and if further down the line Congress wanted to get access to those messages, they wouldn't necessarily be able to do so?
That has been a major focus of the discussion here. And in this Senate hearing this morning, a lot of the questions for the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, were about this issue of, the time this conversation was happening, she was traveling overseas. Signal is not allowed to be installed on government devices. So there's a question about whether everyone involved was using a personal device, which raises other security issues. There are the record issues involved, as you mentioned. There are records retention rules in our country as well, and the disappearing messages settings that were applied to this conversation on Signal would appear to violate a number of those rules. Now, we don't expect that this administration is going to aggressively investigate. We don't expect that this Justice Department is going to, appoint a special counsel to get to the bottom of this. But those are all questions that critics are raising in light of this, in addition to the sort of big picture security question, which is, if American adversaries had access to this information, there's obviously a lot of bad things that could be done with it. If the person who was added was not, a journalist with experience in this area and experience handling sensitive information, who tried to deal with it as professionally and securely as he felt he could.
Right, Tim Montgomerie.
Well, obviously, the security implications that Rachel just raised with you, Molly, absolutely sort of bang on and need to be answered. The thing I think that struck me most about this whole sort of revelations, though, was how unsurprising it was. It wasn't as though we saw a conversation between sort of the senior administration officials that was at an intellectual level we hadn't seen before, or that there was some sort of Machiavellian explanation for what they were doing. It was exactly the sort of same rhetoric we hear in public. It was the same sort of dissing of Europe's contribution to the security situation. There was the horrible emojis attached to what actually is the death of people in a war situation. And so, in a way, I found the whole revelation completely unsurprising and confirmed where this administration is and how it thinks, and not at the perhaps most deep of levels.
Well, I think there was a bit of policy discussion in this group chat, and I found that quite interesting. It was not merely a logistical conversation, right, where they sort of traded, times and methods and that sort of thing about a decision that had already been made. You had the vice president himself raising these potential political concerns. And as you say, echoing in private what he has said in public about his distaste for Europe and his disinclination to do anything for the Europeans. I think it's quite revealing that he was expressing those same attitudes in private, was expressing those same attitudes as a potential objection to something that the president had already decided to do. And in some ways, undercutting President Trump, saying, I'm not sure the president understands, the potential political implications of this, or the political implications of what could result from it in terms of pressure on oil prices and so forth. So I thought it was quite an interesting sort of mini policy discussion that was hashed out here. But as you say, not terribly discordant with the things that particularly Vice President Vance has been saying in public.
Yeah, although J.D. Vance saying that he was reluctant, or at least hesitated, to attack the Houthis of Yemen, who have been carrying out attacks on, well, potentially all shipping, going through on their way to the Suez Canal and back, apart from, of course, Russian shipping, Iranian shipping and Chinese shipping. We're talking about a global threat here, from which the enemies of the West were being exempted. And the Vice President of the United States was saying he didn't like doing much about that because it would help Europe. And America is the only power really capable of doing very much about that in this way. It raises questions. I know there are already questions, aren't there, Molly, about the solidity of the transatlantic alliance. But if you're in that transatlantic alliance on the European side, you'd be maybe more worried now than you were before.
Is it possible for the Europeans to be more worried about the transatlantic alliance? Do we still talk about that in the present tense? Does it still exist?
There is still an alliance. There is still an alliance, and still hopes that it will continue to be one. Although Europe and some European leaders are talking about finding a way to stand more on their own 2 feet. That doesn't mean we're at the point where America has cut loose. And the thought is that maybe this is bringing that sort of thought a little bit closer. That was John Bolton's view. Yeah. And he's had this view for a long while.
I thought that interview you had with John Bolton earlier, John, was really interesting because he is clearly a big critic of Trump. But he's saying Europe mustn't let Trump off the hook by sort of basically saying, OK, we are going to go it alone. I don't think, first of all, Europe is ready to go it alone. We don't have the arms industry, for example, to produce the basic, military gear that we need for our defence. And, Trump will pass. And another American leader may be much more committed to the NATO alliance. So I thought that was a fascinating interview.
But the thing that I found really interesting from the messages is not that they think Europe is freeloading on defence, because we know that they think that. It was the level to which J.D. Vance in particular seems to have a sort of personal hostility to Europe, which really came out hatred. It came out in his Munich speech as well, that it's not just a case of they need to do a bit more. Well, that's what I got from it. It was kind of very much, I don't want us to do a thing that will help us and is in our best interest, because it might also help these countries that are, at least on paper, America's closest allies.
We're still supported doing it. It just felt it sort of stuck in his craw that it would help bail out Europe, because he thinks that America
I think there's personal animosity there.
Well, I think there's legitimate animosity, really, because Europe has freeloaded on America for a very long time. And I can understand an American feeling, God, we're bailing them out again. The key thing was it didn't stop them bailing us out or doing the right thing. It just was mentioned as part of, oh my goodness, we're having to bail out Europe again, which is perfectly fair commentary in my view.
We did, though, see the Defence Secretary is also pretty hostile to Europe in much the same sort of way. Take the time in this conversation to persuade J.D. Vance that this was actually something which needed to be done. It wasn't taken as read that was going to happen. It did happen, absolutely correct. It did happen. But J.D. Vance had to be sort of, had to be just eased back into life.
Yeah, I don't think
like a stroppy teenager.
Well, if anyone has behaved like a stroppy teenager in recent world affairs, it's Europe, I'm afraid, because Europe's been the one that hasn't borne its adult responsibilities as a set of nations.
Yeah, Molly, there's legs in this story, isn't there? As we say in our trade. And for one thing, the White House having denied that there's anything classified that was a part of this conversation, the journalist to whom it was leaked, who found himself on the receiving end of it, he's still got the evidence and what was given him. And he tells us there were such things as information shared on weapons and targets and timing. And if that's not highly sensitive intelligence, I have no idea what is. And he can prove that. It doesn't have to go public with it. I was suggesting earlier on, I'm now just making this up, but you could call in, a dozen reputable people and show them the evidence, and they'll all testify that it is what it is.
Absolutely. And as he said in the article, and, this is a journalist with a quite good reputation, a publication. I actually used to work there with a quite good reputation. As he said, he was withholding the evidence in question because it was, in his view, so sensitive, but it was evidence that led him to know about a significant military action before it took place, and that military action did then take place at exactly the time and in exactly the manner that had been told to him in the group chat. So as you say, if that's not the definition of sort of the kind of information that any government would want to keep secret, I'm not sure what state secrets are for. So, and he has said, Jeffrey Goldberg has said in response to these criticisms from the administration, and of course, they always attack the messenger in these situations, and they have pointed, and they have, and he's a particular foe of Trump and the Trump administration, having been quite harsh on Trump in the past and published articles that they've been critical of in the past. But he has said, they are simply not telling the truth about the nature of this information. And as you say, the proof is right there in the screenshots that he has, and he is not going to share those publicly. But we have heard from some critics saying, well, if they're so sure this information, there's nothing secret about this information, they should go ahead and publish it. And we certainly don't see the administration doing that either.
Right. Molly, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's do it again soon. I mean, tomorrow we're going to be pretty much obsessed with the Chancellor of the Exchequer's spring economic statement. But I won't be surprised if there isn't a moment in our coverage just to keep an eye on this story too and see how it is developing. This is Pienaar and Friends. Tim Montgomerie is here. Rachel Cunliffe is here. I'm John Pienaar, and you're listening to Times Radio. It's 6:31. Let's get the news with Andy Hayes.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Thank you, John. Good evening. Ukraine and Russia have agreed a ceasefire in the Black Sea. The White House says it's got separate commitments from both countries to stop military strikes on energy targets. The US also says it'll help to restore Moscow's agriculture exports, though it's unclear what that means for Western sanctions. Yaroslav Trofimov, chief foreign correspondent with the Wall Street Journal, has told Times Radio that Kyiv has got the better deal.
If you look at what has happened in the last 2 years, Ukraine, by destroying a large part of the Russian Black Sea fleet, has freed up shipping for its main port of Odessa, and it's booming. So in a way, if this deal is executed, it would benefit Russia much more than Ukraine.
Donald Trump says the adding of a journalist to a high-level US group chat was simply a glitch. Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz were in the group, and military strikes on Yemen were discussed. The former footballer Joey Barton's being convicted of assaulting his wife after he grabbed her, pushed her over and kicked her in the head. It happened at their home in southwest London in June 2021. He's been given a 12-week suspended sentence. Georgia Barton had a lump on her forehead and a bleeding nose. And the King and Queen's state visit to the Vatican has been postponed as the Pope recovers from pneumonia. Francis arrived back on Sunday after spending 5 weeks in hospital. Buckingham Palace says it's by mutual agreement. And remember, the finest writers from the Times preview and review the week's football on The Game podcast.
This is Times Radio.
Drive with NatWest Cushion. Empower your employees to feel good about their pension. Search NatWest Cushion today. Capital at risk.
I'm John Pienaar. This is Pienaar and Friends with Tim Montgomerie, with Rachel Cunliffe. And Kate Borsay joins us, who's taking over at 7. Hello, Kate.
Hi, John. We'll dig further into the Signal planning a strike on Yemen with a journalist present in the group debacle that you've been discussing for much of the show today. I noticed that Pete Hegseth, the Defence Secretary, is getting a bit of heat in front of that Senate Intelligence Committee. Both Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, and John Ratcliffe, the CIA Director, were asked that if the information in that Signal group was not classified, then who declassified it, because it would normally be classified information, and they are sort of passing the buck on to Hegseth somewhat. I'm just fascinated by all this, because there is a bit of buck passing, I suppose. You were discussing earlier about the fact that actually Signal is not allowed on government devices in the US, and so therefore was this on personal phones? And actually perhaps if it was on personal phones, that then gives them a get-out clause, because I don't know whether you can classify information on personal phones. Perhaps there's some sort of loophole. I mean, everyone's pretending to be not that bothered about it, but the black and white of the situation, as you've been discussing today, is it is a major screw-up, essentially, and pretty embarrassing. And as the Lib Dems have been pointing out today, you know, in all seriousness, do we need to look at the information that we're sharing with the United States and think about where that might be going, and whether there are other unauthorised, declassified but shouldn't be groups out there that perhaps our information is going to?
And the trouble with that is, when it comes to the sort of intelligence community, America outpunches the rest of the world put together. We in this country are very good at analysing information, and we've got our own ways of gathering information, human intelligence, signals intelligence. GCHQ is especially strong as an asset, and the Canadians are good at analysing information, but when it comes to gathering it in, nobody matches America. So if we're going to try and hold stuff back from them, they're going to know it, and we're asking for some sort of reciprocal action, and we're all going to be the losers, but including we're going to be the losers.
I just think we need some reassurance from them, really, and them smoothing this over and saying it's not a big deal is not reassurance, is it?
It is not. No, it's not.
I'm also old enough to remember when Hillary Clinton occasionally using a private email server was enough to completely disqualify her from the presidency, and as far as Trump was concerned, meant that she belonged in prison. So how times change. Tim gets triggered every time I mention Hillary Clinton.
Not at all.
I can see him twitching in his seat.
He's just taken a little doll out of his pocket. He's sticking pins in it.
Excuse me, I'm still here while you're talking about me, you know.
The two behind the glass are leaning forward, Tim, to see if you actually are taking a doll out of your pocket and sticking pins in it. I was speaking figuratively.
Kate, I think you've got more to tell us, haven't you?
I have got more to tell you. Assisted dying is ready for royal assent in the Isle of Man. We'll be speaking to Alex Allinson, who is the practising GP and the Isle of Man Treasury Minister, who introduced this bill. So it is, in terms of going through the various parliamentary process, pretty much there. It just needs to go to the Ministry of Justice for royal assent here in the UK. I'll be talking to him about the differences with what we're getting in England and Wales. It's been announced today, by the way, that will likely be knocked on another 4 years. But I'll be asking him about the differences and asking him how he overcame some of the problems that we've had with that conversation. How can you be absolutely sure? How do you know if someone's being coerced or is putting themselves under pressure? So I've had a really interesting conversation with him already. And Charlie Parker of The Times has been to Cambridgeshire today, John, where Alpaca Gate is in full flow in a Cambridgeshire gate, a small Cambridgeshire village, because 4 alpacas have been shot dead with a rifle. There's a big investigation underway.
There's a vile story, wasn't it?
Yeah, Charlie's been down there today, and we'll speak to the local MP, actually, to find out how the investigation's going. Sam Carling, he's the very young MP for North West Cambridgeshire. We'll be asking him about Alpaca Gate.
OK, coming up at 7 o'clock, loads there to look forward to. Before we move on, just some of your messages on the Signal fiasco, a debacle. This is from Mike. It says the Signal debacle gave the UK and the continental Europe an invaluable steer on the Trump administration's mindset on the transatlantic alliance. Mike's view there. Scott says, for this American administration, life is cheap and geopolitics is nothing more than a game of risk. And Will writes in, How can you be aghast anymore, let alone expect serious sanctions for the cosplayers occupying senior roles in the US government? On the plus side, I wonder if they used Signal because they didn't want their plotting and backslapping to be monitored by disaffected intelligence staff on the federal secure comms networks they would surely have been told to use. And here's another one in from, it's not signed this one, but it's been placed in front of me. It said, see me on YouTube, and for some reason says, our listener, I expected you to look like Jeremy Clarkson. I don't know why that might be. Now you know I don't look at all like Jeremy Clarkson, and maybe Jeremy and me are both happy about that. Let's talk about the big spring statement tomorrow. The Chancellor going to be on her feet. It's going to be a huge story. We're going to be all over it. We're going to be down at Westminster on College Green in our little black gazebo. That is coming up here on Pienaar and Friends in association with NatWest Cushion, putting your employees in control of their financial future. Just search NatWest Cushion to find out more.
Times
Here on Pienaar and Friends, Tim Montgomerie and Rachel Cunliffe. Let's talk about the spring economic statement, which is going to be happening tomorrow morning. We're going to be following it throughout the day. I'm going to be on College Green in my little black gazebo in the afternoon, talking to anyone and everyone who will talk to me. And a lot of those conversations are going to be absolutely fascinating because they always really, really are. On the spring statement, Rachel and Tim, before we get into the high politics, just a word on the low politics. There's a lot of bad feeling, it seems, isn't there, around the government, among ministers, senior ministers, about the way this is being handled, the way they're having to squeeze their own government departments. And they seem to be looking at the Chancellor and making it pretty clear, looking at Rachel Reeves with a certain amount of hostility, Rachel.
Yeah, I think so. And I think a sense that the fiscal rules that Rachel Reeves is clinging to, which are self-imposed restrictions on government borrowing, put there in part so that Labour could reassure the electorate and the markets that they weren't going to risk the economy like Liz Truss did, but that those fiscal rules are too rigid and are actually pushing the Chancellor into places that she doesn't want to be, and pushing individual ministers in government departments into positions that they don't personally believe in and that they don't think the voters believe in either. And I think that the split in government really are the ones who go, we need to stick by our fiscal rules no matter what, because the one thing that we need to ensure above all else is that people trust us on the economy, and they can dislike us and they can think we're cruel, but if they don't trust us on the economy, then it's all over. And increasingly the alternative view is not trusting a party on the economy might have been a reason to rule them out, but you've got to give people something positive to believe in as well. And the fiscal rules, above everything else, are driving a policy agenda that is increasingly chipping away at all the different policy areas that Labour got into to make big changes in.
Yeah, when I say low politics, I do want to get into the sort of higher level of economic policy and strategy in a moment. But we're seeing some of them taking it out on her in different ways, aren't we? This story about...
You mean all the ministers, Heidi Alexander and Penny Cook going, well, I wouldn't have time to take freebies.
She took Sabrina Carpenter concert tickets, didn't she?
What?
And went into a box with a relative or family member. And we've had a couple of ministers saying, look, I wouldn't have done that. Maybe it's up to individuals, but I wouldn't have done that. And we know that's a bit of a dig.
I think it's a bit of a dig, but I also think it's a dig at her for making this the story when all summer Labour ministers learnt very, very quickly, to their detriment, that behaviour that had been perfectly acceptable in past years, suddenly the public had decided wasn't acceptable. Politicians of all parties took freebies, took free tickets to things. Suddenly we all decided that wasn't okay. Yeah. There were 8 weeks of news on it. It dominated the conference season, and they went, OK, fine, lesson learned. We thought we could do that if we declared it properly. Turns out we can't. We won't. To have this surfacing again now, I think there is a sense of not just dissatisfaction with what the Treasury is doing, what Rachel Reeves is doing, but also you knew what the optics of this was, and yet here we are again.
Tim?
I think probably Labour don't want political advice from me, but if I was to say that at the beginning of this government, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves looked like they had an advantageous political brand, it was that they looked like serious people. They were the people that we would turn to fix a mess. And there have been signs, I don't know whether you, I think I may have actually heard it on your programme last week, Liz Kendall's statement last week on welfare. It was very rah, very political in the House of Commons, when actually it was a serious topic. And I've seen that too much from Labour. We saw it at the beginning with Rachel Reeves, when she sort of overdid the blaming of the inheritance for the problems that Labour were facing, and then kind of cast this cloud over the economy, which has created some of the problems since. And so what I'll be looking for tomorrow from her, and I think from the government generally, is go back to that brand advantage that you could have had, the seriousness that people wanted after the Boris, etc. years. And don't over-politicise it. Just because you'll face the short-term pressures of the kind that Rachel's just described, the temptation maybe to try and win back some of the immediate political capital with your colleagues, etc. But actually don't do the short-term. Go back to your long-term brand advantage and reinforce that, which I think they've been very poor at doing, actually.
Do you agree with that, Rachel? I mean, the way that it was packaged up, certainly in those earlier days, all around the fact that the legacy wasn't just awful, it was way more awful than anyone even imagined. Did they need to do that? Because everyone understood the legacy was terrible.
Well, firstly, I disagree slightly with Tim in that I don't think they were overdoing how bad the legacy was. I mean, we know that there was a crisis in prisons. Prisons were on the brink of collapse. That was one reason for calling the election. We know that the government reserves were spent multiple times over. We know that Rachel Reeves sort of came in her first weekend and was horrified almost to the point of tears by the state of the nation's finances.
She wasn't.
No, I think she was expecting it to be bad.
This really is nonsense. You look
it's not nonsense.
You look at the economy, it's absolutely clear it was recovering. And what they did...
Hold on. The economy was recovering.
They absolutely put a blanket of doom and gloom over that recovery.
I'm coming on to what happened next. I'm coming on to what happened subsequently, and I think that there is truth to that. But Jeremy Hunt, as Chancellor, his final 2p cut on national insurance was completely unaffordable. It was based on figures that I think the head of the ONS has said were worse than fiction. It was completely conjured up out of nowhere, and it was done because they knew that Conservatives were going to lose an election, and they wanted to put Labour in the trap of would they back the NIC cut or not. Yeah. And Labour fell for the trap, and personally, I think they shouldn't have done that.
And Tim, you know that to be true, don't you? I mean, you're not going to dispute the fact that the public spending allocations that were inherited by the government didn't begin to cover the cost of simply keeping services going at their present level. And that was part of the politics pre-election. So the legacy was very grim indeed. and as, again, objectively, surely this is true, as for the economy recovering, we hear this endlessly now from the opposition, but there was a quarter of a tiny uptick in economic growth against several years of British economic growth being second from bottom in the G7 table of growth.
I'm surprised you two are even questioning this. Look, both of these things happen to be true at the same time.
Yeah.
One, the Tories did not leave a good and economic inheritance. That is absolutely true. But also, I think Labour, most politicians, I don't know really any sort of business organisation that now do not recognise that Labour overdid the gloom when they came in.
And I agree with you on
cast
that
this
point.
cloud over
I
the
agree
economy.
with you on that point.
And that is they had a bad inheritance, absolutely the case. They made it worse.
That's
a
tactical criticism, which I'm not.
Not a tactical criticism. It's a substantial criticism because it's cost jobs and it got worse.
Now you're talking about the action that followed from that analysis. But the books were in a dreadful state. That is now beyond contestation.
Well, they were getting better, and I think it was more than one quarter.
I think you can have a debate about that. I won't kind of dwell on that.
I don't support the inheritance tax. Sorry, not inheritance tax cut. The second national insurance tax cut that Jeremy Hunt made on the record in this programme, John, saying that should have been invested in defence. It shouldn't have gone for another tax cut. So no, the inheritance wasn't good, but the idea that Labour didn't make it worse, I think there's very few people who would stand that.
And I wasn't saying that. I was saying that they did inherit an absolute disaster, and then they were so obsessed with making sure that the voters didn't blame them for it, that the voters knew to blame the last lot, that they talked about it too much, and they also framed a lot of the decisions that they made, which were political decisions, because politics is about trade-offs. They framed that in terms of, we don't want to do this, but we have to, rather than making the positive case and going, actually, this is more progressive, this is fairer, this will drive growth, etc., etc. So we had kind of 3 or 4 months where we didn't really know what the government wanted to do, because it kept telling us things that it didn't want to do, but was having to do, which didn't exactly project confidence.
And again, and Tim, trust me, this is not ganging up on you.
I don't mind being ganged up on.
I just agreed with Tim.
I just want to use it as a useful sounding board for this point. If, let us say, the decision to put up national insurance was counterproductive for the purposes of the economy, that it's a tax on jobs, it slows down growth and all that sort of thing, does that mean you dispute the need to raise taxes at all, or are you saying it could have been done through greater borrowing? In which case, how do you answer the question? The markets would have reacted to that, because you're not going to say nothing could have been done.
I think we're confusing two things. The major thing I'm criticising is that period between inheriting office and the budget, when you had this period of uncertainty and a period of everything's going wrong. That was very damaging.
But those arguments were used for the austerity in the budget, and I've used the A word because it's the right word.
And then the budget came. And because they boxed themselves in on tax increases in their general election manifesto, they were only really able to do this huge jobs tax in the form of national insurance, when I think it would have been more helpful for everyone if they slightly wriggled out of their... Well, the best thing, of course, was them not to box themselves in the first place.
So what should they have done then?
I think they were a more even spread of tax
like income
rises.
tax, the basic rate of income tax.
Yeah, that would have been a much more sensible way of doing it. But, of course, they'd made promises that they wouldn't touch those taxes.
That's an argument, and that's a perfectly respectable argument. But had they done that, Tim, you'd have been all over them.
But also, John, just let me finish my point, if I may, is they put up taxes to fund a massive splurge and increase in the National Health Service. And previously they had said that they wouldn't put any money into the National Health Service until at first it had been reformed. And the money went in without any reform. So we have no real confidence that it's being spent wisely. So there's been a whole range of mistakes that they made in that first year. And I think any defence of... Well, I'm surprised that my dear colleague Rachel was making any kind of defence of the chances.
And a lot of money was spent without demanding reform in exchange, and that was another.
And were contrary to what they said they would do.
I mean, I would have reformed pensions. I would have reformed.
Oh, you always reforming pensioners. You poor pensioners.
Have a look at council tax and land values. Have a look at VAT and VAT exemptions, and if you can have a fairer and also a system that brings in more money if you get rid of VAT exemptions and all kinds of things. But all of those things cost a huge amount of political capital. And the thing that I'm most frustrated about with this government is that they seem to have spent a lot of their political capital on things that I believe are right, like withdrawing the winter fuel allowance from wealthy pensioners and...
Not just wealthy pensioners.
Well, all but the poorest pensioners.
That's quite a lot of normal middle income
We've had this debate before, Tim, about how the over 60s in this country are the wealthiest cohort in generation terms, and how you're twice as likely to live in a millionaire household if you're over 65 than you are to live in poverty. We've done all that part of the conversation. We've had the argument. I'm saying they used political capital on that, which raises a comparatively tiny amount of money, and they have created a lot of hostility and animosity against the government to not raise very much in return. If you were going to make yourself that unpopular, you could have done some of the big things, like council tax, like reform of pensions. And so it seems like a lot of political capital spent for not very much money. But Can
I just interrupt you there? Because I agree with you on so much of what you've just said. After
That's why this show is fun.
After having a bit of Barney over between us, because actually the thing that I find most frustrating about this government is actually there was an opportunity with a huge majority to do some big reforms. They didn't do it on welfare reform last week. It was sort of penny-pinching cuts. It wasn't a big sort of universal credit type Ian Duncan Smith reform. They were just it was cheese pairing, really. On tax, raising tax, I'm completely with you on land value taxes. Changing council tax. They could have really change the basis of our taxation system, but they didn't. They just move up the dial in different ways without real reform. And I think when Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer look back at this period in office, the thing they will regret most is that they didn't do reforms. They basically kept the existing system and just raised levels of taxation, and that won't increase or improve the incentive structures in the economy. It's a great missed opportunity.
Isn't it also fair to say that the government hates the use of the word austerity, although it is austerity, but we're not even at the beginning, really, of the austerity to come. But to get to the point that we started the conversation this evening, defence and security, there is still no visible means of providing what is needed by way of building British and other defences, and finding the money to do that. I mean, plumbing and plundering the overseas aid budget has provided a few £1 billion. We're talking about way more than that that's needed to rebuild this country's defences. It's been said that £20 billion is a minimum that's needed to get our armed forces up to a kind of standard that we could say we're rising to the challenge, which is undeniable from Russia and with America retreating. And there's got to be a way to deal with that. Apparently tomorrow, the defence question is going to be running through the Chancellor's speech as well, which he then is raising a problem without offering very much by way of a solution. Isn't that right?
Well, I think that defence has become a headline political issue for all of the reasons that we know, and Keir Starmer's personal ratings have actually gone up since the crisis of security. And I think that there is a feeling that if you can tie things that may not be that popular, whether it's cuts in other departments or tax rises in certain places, if you can tie that to national security and sort of invoke patriotism and invoke defence and a more dangerous world, etc., then people are more willing to have the conversation.
But they haven't made that connection yet, have they?
Listen. They've been sort of trying to do it in rhetoric, but not in terms of actual policy, no. I think that's a missed opportunity, actually.
I agree with that. And yes, we do need to really increase defence spending, but it has to be done at a pace that the system can absorb.
Yes.
The real danger is that, one danger is underspending. The other danger is throwing too much money at a system which can't absorb it quite yet.
Yes.
So the spending needs to be progressively reduced into the system so that we can actually, increase manpower is a key thing. But also we need to reform procurement.
Yes.
We need to decide. We've still got the defence review to come out, which I think is later this year, is it?
Yeah.
And at the moment we still haven't really decided what the shape of our military could be. And given their coordination with European allies, it has to be done in what specific contribution is Britain going to make alongside what Germany or France is making. So it has to be a coordinated response as well.
Yeah, I mean, the defence review still seems to be something of a mystery, which everyone is very, very keen to see. But you're right, about a bit like the time when Gordon Brown was Chancellor and poured squillions into the NHS, more than the NHS knew how to spend. And in the end, they wasted enormous amounts of it just by chucking in every possible direction without the commensurate increase in productivity. As things stand, you can raise billions more for defence, and as things stand, you end up spending it in America because they're the ones making the kit, and we don't just have the capacity.
Just like an awful lot of our environmental spending is being spent in China.
Well, I was going to say also the defence infrastructure also runs up against bat tunnels and all the rest of it like that.
There you go, bat tunnels. We'll let that be the last word. Guys, thank you so much for coming.
It's all about the bats.
Thank you for listening. Ollie Colewood's our producer, Isaac Marley, our technical operator. I'm going to be back tomorrow from 4. at Westminster for the Chancellor's statement. Kate Borsey's up next on Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the times.
It's 7 o'clock. This is Kate Borsey and the